Hello everyone, here at OS Reviews. You're watching our retro throwback look at the Nokia Lumia 710 in 2018. This is a phone that came out in 2011. It was one of the earliest Nokia Windows phones to come out, and even back then it was really a budget-oriented model that sold for around $50 with a 2-year contract with T-Mobile and around $200 unlocked, so it was a budget option even back then. The reason why we're taking a look at it now is because you can find it in refurbished or new condition like this one for around $5, making it absolutely the cheapest cell phone, smartphone that you can find for the price. So we're going to find out, what it's like to really use a $5 phone. And at $5, it's less than the price of an appetizer at a restaurant. So it really is super cheap, even if you're just using it for playing back music as an MP3 player, giving it to a child as a backup emergency phone. There is just really not much you can get these days for $5, so it's incredible to see you can get a smartphone at this cost in refurbished condition. Alright, so revisiting some of the specs here, the 710 has a 3.7-inch display. It's an IPS LCD panel, but still incorporates what Nokia calls true black technology. So the screen should have pretty good contrast with darker colors versus the lighter ones. Let's tap on the power key to see if there's any juice, and it seems like there's a little bit of power left. And as a quick comparison in terms of size, here it is next to the Nokia Lumia 800. These phones were released pretty much sequentially. The 800 was the flagship model that resembles in design the Nokia N9, and many other Nokia Windows phones also have the same recycled curved polycarbonate look versus the 710, which was kind of their budget offering that has a chunkier, not as refined look. But in my opinion, it's still a pretty interesting design because it has these purposefully cut off corners on the top and the bottoms that is actually borrowed from an older phone that we also did a retro video on called the Nokia X7 Journey. The X7 looks like this, if you guys remember. We just did a throwback review on this a few months back, and it ran on Symbian OS, also a pretty cool phone. But this one, of course, is now running on Windows Phone. But this was before Nokia were acquired officially by Microsoft. And in terms of specifications, one of the best things about Windows phones at the time was they had very clear parameters on what type of hardware was required to run the operating system. For instance, it needed at least a 1 GHz processor, at least 512 megabytes of RAM, and as a result, even budget phones running on Windows Phone in 2011 were significantly faster than their Android counterparts, which probably had a single-core 600 megahertz processor versus this one, which had a Snapdragon S2 clocked at 1.4 gigahertz, and it also has a 5 megapixel camera on the back. So even though it's budget for a Windows phone, performance was actually quite similar in terms of processing power as the flagship 800 at the time. There is a earpiece on the top, but there is no front-facing camera, so no selfies, unfortunately. There are 3 keys on the bottom, which are physical hardware keys as opposed to being capacitive and on-screen, but they still function pretty well. And let's just skip through some of these settings here. On the right-hand edge, there's access to a volume rocker, and on the top, there's a standard 3.5mm headphone jack, a micro USB port for charging, and a power on-off switch. And on the back, there is a loudspeaker, the 5 megapixel autofocus camera with LED flash, and the Nokia logo. And the back is made out of a soft-touch rubber material that feels pretty grippy and comfortable to hold, but it's different from the unibody build of the more hard polycarbonate that you find on the 800 there, which has a sleeker overall design, but this one is a bit more comfortable in your hands. One thing about soft-touch rubber, however, is it does degrade, so after about 7 years or so, even though it's just been sitting in storage, it does have a tendency to get slightly more stickier. So for an older phone, I personally would prefer one that has a harder material. But nonetheless, it works pretty well. The side also has a dedicated camera shutter key for taking images. I can actually peel back the back cover like this to have access to the battery inside, which has been pre-inserted. Nokia has always made pretty great displays for their smartphones. Even on budget phones like this, you can see that contrast is indeed very inky for a LCD screen. In fact, it almost reminds me of an AMOLED panel, and it's also very sensitive. They actually made some of the first phones on the market that could be used with a glove on, so very sensitive displays which are easy to navigate, which is nice. And in terms of the layout here, again, pretty stock. It just runs on Windows Phone 7.5 Mango, so that's no longer the newest version of Windows Phone. But tapping on the search key here will always bring us to Bing, where we can go through any queries, search the web, and there's also some fun facts and wallpapers that will automatically change depending on the time and date. Other commands include double tapping on the back key to go to the previously opened application on the phone, which is actually pretty handy. I can also long hold on the back key to open up multitasking for Windows Phone. We have access to Microsoft Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, and we're able to create new documents as well. So for instance, I can create a Word and start typing along. The keyboard, as you can see here, doesn't seem as large as on a modern phone just because of the smaller screen of the device, but it's also not too bad just because the screen is really sensitive, so you can still type along at a pretty fast pace, and it does have predictive text that will automatically correct your errors as you go along. You can copy and paste without any problems either, and there is also an accelerometer if you want to rotate the display for a slightly larger typing experience. So when it comes to things like text messaging, things like emailing, the phone still works quite well for my quick hands-on so far. So next, let's take a quick look at, say, the camera performance. One of the nice things about this phone is it has a dedicated camera key that you can access by long holding, and then it pops into the camera interface. And again, it does a decent job because it is an autofocus lens, but definitely isn't as fast to focus as on, let's say, a flagship level phone. Nokia has traditionally been very strong with mobile photography, and this phone is really no exception, despite the lack of a Carl Zeiss kind of branding to the lens on the back here. The camera still performs better than expected, especially now at its price of only $5. I don't think you can even find a digital camera for $5, let alone one that is built into a smartphone. And again, it does a pretty decent job of sharing things onto social media. I think you'll be just fine. You can also do an auto fix, so there is a very light kind of photo editor tool built into Windows Phone 7.5 Mango, and you can actually create an auto kind of save, and it just brightens up the image in this case. And if I want to, I can save the changes. Video is definitely not as impressive as the photo capabilities of the phone. However, you can only record up to 720p HD resolution, and the aspect ratio isn't very large, so it has a slightly kind of boxed in effect when you're viewing it back on this 16:9 aspect ratio screen. And also there's no optical image stabilization, so it can get a little bit jumpy if you're moving around too quickly, but it is there if you need to very quickly capture a few moments when on the go. So next, let's take a quick look at the web browsing and whether this still holds up in 2018, whether it works at all, in fact. So I've loaded up mobile YouTube through the Internet Explorer browser, and the surprising thing is it actually is still scrolling along actually very quickly. There's an accelerometer, so you can also tilt the display, and that works fairly well. And you can go to mobile YouTube, and videos still play back just fine. You can play it back in HQ or high quality versus standard quality. The thing about high quality videos, however, is they do take significantly longer to load, and sometimes they have to buffer in between. It's no longer as smooth as it was when the phone first came out. On the other hand, a standard quality video will load up much faster, especially if it's under 15 minutes long. You don't really have to wait at all. Now, it does open it up in kind of a separate text box and a separate kind of viewer that isn't just through the browser directly. That kind of optimizes the video playback experience. And more complex pages will also load up for the most part without too many problems, but you do need to update the Internet Explorer app by downloading it to the latest version. Otherwise, you may run into some errors here and there. So for instance, if you try the New York Times, which is a very complex page, you can see that it's having trouble displaying it fully, maybe because the memory is too low. Not too sure there, especially if you're trying to load back the full version of the website instead of the mobile version of the site, because the New York Times is a good example of a complex page that has many ads, many videos, and scrolling photos, a lot of elements that, again, make it difficult for lower-end hardware to run. But for simpler pages, things like a quick Google search, news, weather, it more than suffices. Things like YouTube also work without too many problems either. So you can open up, again, Wikipedia, again, taking a little bit longer than usual to load, but it will fully load up after a few seconds, and pinch to zoom does work quite well too on the device. As far as phone call quality is concerned, I would say the 710 does a good job. It has dual microphones on board, so it does have noise cancellation. If you're walking down a busy street, it tends to try to block out the sounds of people around you and still picks up your voice nicely. I tried testing it with T-Mobile here in the United States, and I received about 3 bars of reception, and I was pretty satisfied with the voice calls that I was hearing. The speakers sounded loud and clear, and my callers didn't have any problems hearing me either. So for things like making phone calls, again, it still works quite well. Now, the biggest downsides of Windows Phone, especially in 2018, would definitely be app compatibility, especially since many apps are no longer supported. They definitely aren't getting any more updates now that Microsoft has basically said that Windows Phone is dead. The marketplace does still have a few popular titles, things like Facebook, things like Twitter, WhatsApp are available for download, but they're not as optimized as their Android counterparts, which means that a lot of times you may encounter longer loading times, you may encounter more bugs, and there's definitely less games and apps that you can find as well. But then again, we have to remember that we're taking a look back at this phone because it's only $5 refurbished now. And at that price, it's really hard to complain about anything at all, let alone the fact that it doesn't have as many apps, because you can't really even get a feature phone or a flip phone at this price. And overall, I found it to still be, again, a surprisingly snappy experience just because of how well Windows Phone is optimized. And again, it's definitely helped by the fact that it has a 1.4 gigahertz processor, which for a budget phone is actually quite decent, and you don't really encounter any stuttering or slowdown when it comes to general navigation, which again is quite surprising for a super low-cost device. So thanks for watching this throwback look at the Nokia Lumia 710 here at OS Reviews.